My name is Elena Grace Rivera. I'm 29 years old, and I live in an old walk-up apartment in Seattle, 3 blocks from the Elliott Bay Trail. I work afternoons at a non-profit that helps families navigate the foster care system, which is the cruelest kind of irony now that my own family has fractured. Emotionally, I'm raw and frayed at the edges, like the denim jacket I can't seem to throw away. I sleep poorly, I sip coffee like medicine, and I spend more time staring out the window at water and ferries than I do sleeping. I came back to my childhood home 2 weeks ago because my marriage had ended and because I couldn't afford the rent on my own yet. I thought I would find shelter there. Instead, I found an accusation. Before I dive in, if you're into real stories that hit deep, please consider subscribing. Sharing this isn't easy for me, but maybe someone out there needs to hear it. It was raining the day I heard it, the kind of gray, needle-fine rain that makes the city smell like wet pine and hot asphalt. The house, my adoptive mother Louise's house, smells the same every time I walk in. Lemon cleaner, cigarettes that never fully left the chaise on the porch, and the old comforting musk of Chenin that Louise keeps in her wine rack. The radiator clanked like it was remembering winters from decades ago. Louise is the kind of woman who never lets the quiet sit unbothered. She fills silence with opinions, and with the radio playing an old country station low enough to be background static. She is sharp and careful and has always been proud, the kind of proud that tightens jawlines and keeps apologies at bay. We were on the kitchen back porch, the one with warped boards and a potted rosemary that still survived her neglect. My suitcase was open on a chair. My divorce papers waited unopened on the table. I had told her I needed a place for a few weeks while I figured things out. I had expected a frayed embrace, a casserole, a clucking about leasing and finances. Instead, we sat at that rickety table while rain freckled the vinyl, and she asked, with a calm so practiced it could cut glass, why I had left my husband. Because he stopped looking at me, I said. Because I felt invisible. Her response was a slow, deliberate exhale, the kind that meant she was parceling out judgment like bread. You always did have a flair for drama, Elena, she said. You always made choices that made trouble for yourself. Maybe that didn't come from me. I remember every small thing that happened after. The flash of rain against the trees, the soup ladle ticking on the sideboard, the exact way her ring caught the light. I remember my chest tightening as if someone had wrapped a belt around it. I remember thinking, in a small, frightened voice inside my head, that whatever came out next would be the fulcrum on which I either went back into the life I left or stepped irrevocably away. Then she said it. You're not really family, you know, Louise said, and for a second the radio swallowed the sound of the rain and I could only hear the slow thrum of my own blood in my ears. The words were not raised. They didn't need to be. They landed like a cold plate across my ribs. I laughed. Because what else do you do with something that feels like a slap? What do you mean? I mean that you came to us. You're ours because we chose you. But you're not blood. You're not one of us. There's a difference, Elena. Don't pretend it's not there. It was not the first time she had reminded me of my being chosen rather than born into the family, but the delivery was new, sharp, almost triumphant, like a tiny, cruel victory in some private calculus. The sentence left me ragged. I felt the old thread of something being pulled, a string that ran back through my childhood, school photographs where I was the other in family pictures, whispered comments over Thanksgiving about where she came from, the way neighbors would look at our family as if we were a charity exhibit. My hands trembled. I wanted to make it a joke, to tell her that none of this mattered because I loved both her and my father, because I grew up in that house and memorized the lines on their faces. Instead, I said very quietly, "So what? That changes what, exactly?" She pursed her lips. "It changes everything. You have to understand. There's a loyalty that comes with blood. A bond you can't buy. I hope you don't make choices that betray that." Betrayal. The word sat there between us like a cinder block. I could have told her then about the months before my adoption, the hospital room, a woman who refused to look at me, the agency's soft voices. But I didn't. I swallowed the urge to remind her that she had fought for me in the courtrooms, that she had sewn my Halloween costumes, that she had sat up nights with me when my stomach hurt or when I had nightmares about teeth falling out. I didn't remind her because the truth is, you can't be both the person who gave me shelter and the one who reduced me to a status. Instead, I left. I took my suitcase and stepped into the rain. It was cold against my neck, and I felt like a raw thing wrapped in cheap fabric. I walked until my shoes were wet and my cheeks had dried salt from tears. At the corner, I stood under the awning of a closed cafe and let myself breathe. The city smelled like wet pavement and diesel and 1,000 people trying to get somewhere else. I had no plan. For the next few days, I floated through fog. The house felt like it belonged to someone else. Every item was a potential accusation. Her words, "You're not really family," lodged under my ribs and refused to let go. Sleep was thin and restless. Sometimes I replayed the sentence until it turned into something worse in my head, a dissertation on identity that I wasn't ready to confront. Other times I simply moved through tasks, packing a box, folding a shirt, answering emails from a coworker who thought my sudden absence was vacation. At night, when I couldn't sleep, I would sit at my small kitchen table and try to map out what loyalty even meant. Is it blood and nothing else? Is it time and tending? Is it simply who shows up when there's no light left? Those questions felt like cliffs with no bottom. One evening, 2 days after I'd left, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my sister, my adoptive sister Natalie, who lives 3 states away and who calls on Tuesdays like clockwork. Phone call. The text read. I called. The line clicked to life with her warm, familiar voice. "Elle," she said. "You okay?" Mom sounded weird. "She called me not family," I said, and the tremor in my voice surprised me. "She told me I wasn't blood and that I should remember my place." There was a pause, and then Natalie said, "I always hated that, coming from her. She doesn't know how to hold 2 loves at once. She thinks loving you threatens something." "Threatens what?" I asked. "Control, mostly," she said. "But, Elle, there's something else. When I told Mom you were thinking of leaving, she went quiet and rummaged through some old files. She has kept a lot of things locked away. You might want to look into that. She wouldn't tell me, but there are always papers." Her words tugged at something possessed of dangerous possibility. I had lived my whole life with a complicated gratitude toward Louise. She had been my mother in every functional sense, but there was also a hollow I could not name. What if she had been protecting more than she had revealed? What if, in telling me I was not blood, she was trying to warn me off of the past she had bandaged over? That night, I lay awake and thought about birth certificates and agency files, about how often lies are told with the kindest intentions. I thought of the nurse who had handed me to Louise and Dan in a plastic-covered hospital room and how small I had felt then, like a thing passed from hand to hand. The decision I made wasn't romantic or dramatic. It wasn't a shout into a courtroom. It was, at first, a question. Could I find the paper trail? Where my identity felt like a clay pot someone else has molded, I wanted to hold the original lump of clay and see what it had been. If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people. So I started making calls. I started with the county clerk's office, because there are always records somewhere. And then, quietly, to an intake worker at a small agency that had been operating for longer than I remembered. I wasn't sure what I would find. I only knew that Louise's words had cracked something open inside me, something patient and hungry. When the clerk on the other end of the line said the word, sealed, I felt the floor tilt. She said it so plainly. Adoption records are sealed in our county unless there's a court order, and her voice had the bureaucratic immunity of someone used to heartbreak. I had to ask what it would take to unseal them. The steps were tedious and familiar. Petitions, affidavits, sometimes DNA, sometimes a judge's discretion. The clerk suggested I talk to a lawyer who specialized in family law and adoption records. I thought of backing down. I thought about the cost, the pain of dredging up a past that had been kept tucked away. But the image of Louise's face, the small tightening that had released the sentence like a dart, followed me. If she could say those words without flinching, surely knowing what else she had kept quiet would be my right. I scraped together savings, worked extra shifts, and found a small lawyer who took my case on a sliding scale. Her name was Mara, and she smelled like peppermint and old books. She listened to my story without flinching and then put down the pen as if the matter were both business and a kind of mercy. Closed adoptions are complicated, she said. Sometimes the documents will say a child's birth mother was from another state. Sometimes they're redacted. But we can petition. We can ask for identification records. It might take months, but we'll try. Mara was careful in a way that felt like armor. There were forms and court dates and the kind of legal wording that had nothing to do with human feeling. Somewhere in those heaps of paper was the story of my beginnings. Not a tidy scrapbook, but a messy, human tangle. Louise had saved photographs and certificates and cross-checked them into albums. Had she also been keeping other things sealed out of kindness, fear, or shame? I couldn't know yet. I only knew the sound my chest made when I thought of asking. While the paperwork crawled through the judicial system, life continued its small cruelties. Louise called twice a week with thin concern and thick judgment. Each time, I could hear the careful edges in her voice. "Are you sure you're making the right choice?" she'd say. "It doesn't make sense to reopen old wounds. We gave you everything." Between court dates and work shifts, I started to dig into details that lived outside legal files. I reread the only letter I had from my birth mother, an envelope in Louise's locked drawer I had once been allowed to peek at as a child. I remembered the name on it, a first name scratched in a hurried script, Rosa. It had been sealed with a postmark from a small town in Oklahoma. A Google search turned up a town with one stoplight and a diner with a neon sign flickering the word, open. My imagination could make anything of that, a flourishing family, a dead end, a woman who had loved and lost. And then, almost like a fluke, I found a name. There was a juvenile records database that was not easy to navigate, and I didn't have direct access, but a woman at work, a social worker named Dana who had taken to me with a professional softness, offered to run a check. She had been careful about confidentiality, but she recognized my desperation, and her heart is the sort that leaks into action. "There's a name that matches the last name in some of the adoption forms," she told me quietly in the break room, "the way you share a secret you don't yet understand." "You sure you want me to confirm?" "I have to," I said. There was something aching in my chest, equal parts hunger and dread. It felt like a cliff-edge stare into ocean. The name that surfaced was Jonah Herrera, a 14-year-old who had been in and out of group homes, listed as a ward of the state. His last placement was 3 counties over, in a juvenile shelter that stacked cots in a gymnasium. The state records had him labeled with the kind of shorthand that reduced full human lives to case numbers and boxes checked: truancy, neglect, domestic transition. There was a photo from a court filing, grainy and pale, where his cheekbone caught the light and his eyes were sideways like he watched the world with some small, constant suspicion. When I first saw his photograph, I felt dizzy. He had my nose, a stubborn curve at the bridge that I recognized like an old habit. I could see how Louise had chosen me, how she saw the features she'd cherish. I could also see, or thought I could see, a reflection of the hands that had made up my own history. Whatever line ran from my birth mother to me widened, and in that widening was a person who had probably never been offered a casserole or a warm bed and who might be, if the cruel mechanics of statistics held true, slipping through systems meant to catch him. I drove to see him the next morning. The shelter smelled like bleach and bodies pressed against one another to keep warm. It had fluorescent lights that buzzed like nervous insects. Jonah was taller than I expected, all lanky limbs and an old hoodie that swallowed him. He kept his head down. The first thing he said to me was not the expected question of who I was but an arid, "You lost." The guard at the desk had warned me that kids there were guarded. I showed him my ID, and the guard, an exhausted woman with a lanyard, made a call. "She says she's connected," the guard said to Jonah. "She says she's related." Jonah's look when he finally glanced up cracked something into view. His eyes had the same stubborn set my reflection had in mirrors. There was a wariness that belonged to someone who had learned early how to survive without being seen. I told him my name. I told him about Louise and about the sealed papers. He listened like someone used to being skeptical about adults promising constellations and then leaving him alone to count the stars. "You're not my mother," he said after a while. "Why should I care?" Because I had walked into a place that smelled of bleach and desperation, and because the idea of not trying froze something in me, I did something that felt both reckless and necessary. I told him the truth, not the whole legal tangle, but the honest, pulpy heart of it. "I was adopted," I said. "I grew up with people who took care of me. I'm not your mother either. But I think we share something. I'm trying to find out if we're actually related. I want to know if you're okay." He laughed then, but it was no kind of humor. It was edged, like glass. "People like you show up to tell us how sorry they are. They give us peanut butter and then leave. Why would you be different?" It was a reasonable suspicion. The shelter itself had a history of well-meaning volunteers coming through with casseroles and a list of platitudes. I knew how easy it was to be a story to other people's charity. I didn't have the energy to be performative. I had to be honest. "Because I know what it means to be put into someone's arms and be told you're wanted," I said. "And I also know what it feels like to be told you're not. I don't want you to be alone." He was quiet for a long while. The overhead lights hummed. Outside, rain hit the parking lot in staccato. The shelter's volunteers rotated through like migratory birds. A counselor hovered nearby with a clipboard, but he let us talk. "Do you have somewhere to go?" I asked. "No," Jonah said. "My last foster family sent me back. I keep moving because no one wants to be stuck with me." I thought of the ways I had been stuck. In Louise's shadow, in a marriage that didn't fit, in a life that felt too small, and I felt a tenderness that surprised me into action. I walked out of the shelter with no plan and a head full of legalese. All I knew was that I could not stand the thought of Jonah staying in that gymnasium another night without someone at least sitting up with him. I offered him my couch. He looked at me like I'd offered a lifeboat made of paper. "You live where?" he asked. "Seattle," I said. "It's not fancy. I'll pick you up." He hesitated like a man weighing arsenic and sugar. "How do I know you're not some social worker trick?" "Because I'm not," I said. "Because I just want to offer you a place where you don't wake up to fluorescent lights. No forms, no speeches. Just a couch, and maybe a real bed if you want to try." He shrugged. "I don't want to be your problem." "You won't be," I said. "We can figure this out together." When Jonah got into the passenger seat of my car, he had a duffel bag that smelled like old laundry and a baseball cap pulled low. I caught his profile in my side mirror and remembered the moment of my own exit, the way the nurse handed me into a stranger's arms. I realized then that families are built in the space between one person's leaving and another person's decision to stay. If this is resonating, leave a comment. I'm reading everything. The drive back to Seattle was long enough for silence to become a language. Jonah kept his face turned toward the window, watching as highways rolled into suburbs and then into the city I had always called home. The rain had stopped. The sky had the pale, washed-out look of a day that wasn't certain about sunshine. He smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and something sweet, candy maybe, that told me he had been a child once and had been trying to hold on. We didn't speak much. I used the small, careful phrases people use around newness. "Do you want coffee?" "I have toothpaste. There's a blanket if you want it." He accepted all of them with a guarded economy. At my building, we took the elevator up, and his gaze flicked to the doorframe, to the hallway, the small things people notice when they've been taught to look for trouble. He walked into my apartment like a man entering a temporary truce. My apartment is small and full of other people's second-hand furniture. A thrift store couch, a bookshelf sagging with donated novels, plants that I never quite managed to keep alive. It smelled briefly of boxed pizza. I had bought a container of minestrone and heated it for us. We ate at the kitchen table like two people trying not to fill the silence with heavy pronouncements. Jonah ate slowly, careful to mind his utensils, like manners taught in a different life. "You said you work with kids?" he asked. "I do," I said. Mostly foster teens. I help families with paperwork and placements. Sometimes it feels like putting band-aids on a dam. He snorted, a small sound, and then he said, "Are you one of those people who thinks everything can be fixed with some paperwork? Because it's not." "I'm not naive," I said. "But I do believe people can decide to be kinder." "That's not what I meant," he said. "I meant," he trailed off, eyes going dark, like a memory with an aggressive corner. "People promise things. They say they'll be there. They leave. And you don't." I began. "I don't want to believe anyone," he finished. "It's safer." I understood that more profoundly than I would have liked. Choice had always felt like a scarce commodity in my life, a decision made by someone else on my behalf, again and again. Offering Jonah a place to sleep was the most radical choice I'd made in months. I had no plan for the fallout from Louise when, not if, she discovered I had taken in a ward of the state who might be my brother. I had savings for a short while, and a job that paid enough to cover rent and groceries. But adoption and guardianship are forms of bureaucracy that can chew through savings like teeth on bone. That night I sat on the floor next to the couch, while Jonah slept on it with his knees drawn up, and I felt an ancient, trembly mix of fear and belonging. He kept including himself in my life with the same hesitant grace I had once used as a child. There was something quiet and stubborn about him that I recognized and loved. The next morning, Jonah vanished. Not like a dramatic disappearing, but with the economy of someone used to moving when adults' moods shift. The bedroom was cold. His duffel was gone. My stomach dropped in the hollow theater of someone whose expectations have been trained to disappointment. He left without a note, but he left a sweatshirt on the armrest. I sat with it and felt like the textile held a small memory, an imprint of a person who had briefly been willing to trust. He came back 2 days later. He said he had thought about checking himself into a shelter, then decided he couldn't handle the fluorescent light. "My head hurts," he told me. "I can't sit in that place and have people ask me for DNA or history or why I'm so angry. I can't explain the anger." "I'm not asking you to explain everything right now," I said. "But if you want to stay, I'll help you find options. And if you don't, I won't force you." He stayed. He started working a part-time job at a grocery store near my street. He had a slow way of learning chores and an impatient quickness with sarcasm. He'd cook a meal and then walk it into the living room, set it on the coffee table, and say, "Don't let it go to waste." He began to sleep better, as if the couch had become a practiced cave instead of a temporary refuge. Meanwhile, the legal wheels turned at a turtle's pace. Mara, my lawyer, filed the petition to unseal the records, and then another petition to allow me supervised access to juvenile records so I could provide evidence of a familial connection for a guardianship consideration. The judge assigned to the matter was meticulous and seemed to like sentences that could be folded into legal briefs. The state, when notified that an adult who might be biologically related to Jonah wished to assume guardianship, sent a social worker to my apartment. Her name was Carmen. She had gentle eyes and the authoritative softness of people who handle heartbreak for a living. Carmen came with a clipboard and a list of questions. She asked about my finances, my employment, my living conditions. She asked whether I had any prior convictions, whether I had been in any relationships that might complicate the custody. She also asked, bluntly, why I wanted him. "Why a kid like him?" she asked. "You could adopt a baby. You could do anything." "Because of something that isn't just paperwork," I said. "This matters to me. Maybe because I was given a life I didn't ask for, I want to give him one that isn't defined by abandonment." She nodded slowly, as if she'd heard that before and still wanted to believe it. "We can do a background check on you," she said. "We can do home visits. Guardianship isn't a rubber stamp thing." Louise found out, as predictably as rainfall finds the gutters. I had hoped she'd react differently, or perhaps not at all, but she called in a voice that was brittle with indignation. "You brought a stranger into my house," she asked at me. "Into the community? Do you know what people will think? You show up at Christmas with a foster kid and expect us to pretend he's one of us." He's not a stranger, I said. He might be my brother. Brother or not, Louise snapped. You made a theater of it. You always did need things to be dramatic. You can't drag the whole family into whatever this is. The fight held every old architecture of our relationship. Her insistence on appearances, my insistence on doing what's right even if it appends the neatness she prizes. She accused me of selfishness, of flaunting my decisions in ways that threatened the quiet order of her life. I felt my voice thin and raw. I am doing what's right, I said. And I'm giving him a chance to be part of something steady. He's not family, she repeated, slower this time, as if saying it slowly would make it true. And you know it. I hung up and sat on the kitchen floor and felt small and enormous at the same time. There was a choice to make, to step back and try to repair the relationship with Louise, to close the petition and send Jonah back to the shelter, or to keep moving forward, perhaps severing the woman who'd raised me in the process. When I told Jonah about the confrontation, he was quiet. He wasn't surprised. She probably thinks people like me are contagious, he said. Like if you touch us you'll get the same homeless genes. I don't believe that, I said. I believe family is something you make. The decision that came after that was not lightning-struck or cinematic. There was no grand speech. There was only a slow, persistent choosing. I filed for temporary guardianship paperwork in a county courthouse, wrote statements about my intentions, and waited. In the meantime, I opened my home fully to Jonah. His clothes, his music, his particular way of sitting in the corner and reading late into the night, the way he pressed his palms tightly when he had nightmares. I took him to a doctor, to a therapist who specialized in trauma, and I held his hand through an intake where he muttered a lot and then looked up at the ceiling and caught my eye like a small, grateful child. The morning the judge signed a temporary order allowing me to have parental responsibility for Jonah while the state evaluated the permanent placement, I cried in the Civic Center bathroom. My mascara made dark raccoon rings under my eyes. When I left the building, the city was cold and shimmering with leftover rain. The decision felt like both a beginning and a rupture. In choosing to bring him into my life, legally, physically, with papers and signatures, I had chosen a path that would almost certainly mean losing something else. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear how this ends. I whispered to no one in particular, the way you say things into the world like small spells. When the news made it to the neighborhood grapevine, the ripples were predictable and sharp. There were the pitying looks from women who had known Louise longer than I'd known the ground beneath my feet. There were the calls from cousins who asked in a voice lubricated by curiosity whether I'd made a mistake. There was the larger unspoken current. Adoption had been a clean line in our family's narrative, something polished and soft. Bringing Jonah into the story introduced knots. Louise's response hardened. She began to make choices that were quieter and more punitive. She cancelled the regular dinners she had hosted, a small social ritual where my friends sometimes came. She ignored my texts for weeks on end, and when she did speak, her voice had an editorial coolness. You should be careful, she told Natalie one day, loud enough for me to hear when I came by to pick up a box of old books. He could be dangerous. People who come from certain backgrounds can bring trouble. I watched Natalie collapse in private. My sister, who had once been my fiercest ally in scraped-knee crises and school musicals, looked between the two of us like someone trying to stitch a rent seam that only widened with every tug. Mom, she pleaded once, you can't just erase her. I can if I want to, Louise said. She had the look of someone wielding a gate, a key, a final portion of authority. She wielded it with an almost bored cruelty. If she had once been a safe harbor for me, now she was a checkpoint that demanded emotional passports. The state wanted reports. The therapists wanted session notes. The shelter wanted updates. Jonah, for his part, teetered between bravery and anger. He hated the way others looked at him, as if his existence was a spectacle. He also hated the way I kept fighting for him, as if my advocacy were a bright light he couldn't hide from. He had learned early the satisfaction of pushing people away. It was a defense mechanism that tasted like armor. At work, the irony of my life pressed in. I navigated placement forms for other children while wrestling with the file folder that was mine to hold. Coworkers asked quiet questions. Is it true? They'd say like confidants and then look away. I learned to tell the short version when asked. I think he might be related. I'm trying to help him. The long version was a tangle of adoption law and family obligations, and an old woman who preferred an orderly house to a living, breathing family. The court hearings were thin and cold. I sat in a chair that squeaked like a thing from a diner and watched lawyers marshal words like armies. Louise's lawyer was sharp and efficient and suggested that I was unstable, that my recent divorce had left me emotionally compromised. She has a history of making impulsive choices, the lawyer said, which felt like a hat tip to the old narrative that had accompanied me since childhood. My lawyer, Mara, cross-referenced dates and pointed to my steady job, my clear background checks, the therapist's notes that said Jonah had improved with stability. It was not clean victory. The judge signed a more robust visitation plan than I preferred, and the adoption process, should it come to that, was bracketed in procedural forms. Louise's objections contained an ugly kernel. Not a legal argument but a moral one. She argued in a tone that smelled like perfumed absolution, that bloodline matters, that certain ties are what make us who we are. She was articulate in ways that made me remember the time she taught me how to set a table. All the manners, the social choreography of families who had learned how to be seen. The one night that broke me was a Tuesday in December when the heater in my apartment sputtered and went out entirely. The city was cold enough to see your breath indoors, and Jonah was sick with a fever that made him ramble like a dreamer. I wrapped him in 3 blankets and sat with my knees to my chest on the floor because the couch felt like a place for two, and I was not ready to encroach. The apartment smelled like tea and radiator dust. My phone buzzed with a message from Louise that read simply, "You are making a mistake." It would have been easy to fold then, to admit defeat and hand Jonah back to a system that would, in time, teach him how to survive in cages of bureaucracy. But then he woke up, feverish and with a small, honest look in his eyes, and asked very softly, "Are you going to leave me too?" The question made me angry in a way that was bigger than fear. It was not his fault that he expected abandonment. It was not his fault that people who were supposed to be safe had left. It was my job now, perhaps my moral imperative, perhaps an undone debt, to be the person who did not leave. So I doubled down. I arranged for us to see a specialist who worked with at-risk teens. We sat in waiting rooms with magazines that tasted of bleach and stale coffee. Jonah made progress in therapy, small increments. A night he slept through without nightmares. A day he showed up to work without hugging the back of his hand. A conversation in which he described a memory of a summer barbecue that made him smile. I learned to celebrate wins that used to be mundane. A letter of recommendation from his manager, a dental cleaning. Each victory carved a small room in my heart. Louise's coldness escalated. She wrote me a letter, not by email, but on stationery, with a pen that pressed deep into the fibers. It read like a treaty broken. "I didn't raise you to become someone who elevates a stranger over her own home," it said. "Do not come to my kitchen table and demand shelter for others when you cannot hold your own responsibilities." I read the letter and felt like a child hearing a verdict. But amidst the ache was a steady current that I could no longer deny. Whatever relationship I had with Louise had always been conditional. Her affection had been lavish, but it had been laced with expectation. She loved me because she had chosen to love me, and there is nothing inherently wrong with that, but now that my choices diverged from the life she had imagined for me, she recoiled. The radical choice, the one that changed everything, was to keep showing up. To be boringly stubborn. To take Jonah to the doctor, to call the social worker back after the 4th time she had withheld information, to take on second shifts when savings dwindled, to learn about trauma-informed care, about how to sit with a teenager whose trust had been dissected and rationed. To become the person I needed when thinking back to the hospital where I'd once been delivered into different hands. If Louise wanted to unlatch herself from me because I had chosen another human to be part of my life, she could. I had to hold both truths, that this might cost me the woman who had raised me, and that it was worth the cost if, in the end, another person did not have to learn abandonment as a curriculum. This was my morality enacted by small, stubborn choices. Morning light in Seattle is like a slow reveal. It starts gray and then, if you're patient, finds the city's edges and makes a kind of art of them. The mornings after the court's temporary decision were full of coffee and practicalities. There were forms to sign, therapists to call, a dentist appointment to schedule for Jonah, which he met with an exaggerated groan that softened when he saw the hygienist's tattoo of a dog's face. Life, extraordinary in its ordinariness, stitched itself into a pattern. The months that followed were a series of negotiation and reclamation. Jonah enrolled at night school to make up credits. He worked afternoons at a bookstore and came home with a stack of dog-eared paperbacks, each with a corner dog-eared as if to collect memories. We argued like any cohabitants do, about dishes, about a long-lost hoodie, about showings on Sunday when the landlord insisted. The arguments were small and had the shape of people who mattered to each other. Imperfect, raw, and necessary. Louise did not come around quickly. She sent a few terse messages that were more updating than reaching out, like a meteorologist reporting weather after a storm. "I hear you have a teenager now," she wrote in late spring, all courtesy and chill. "I hope you are not stretching yourself thin." I wanted to respond with the patience of someone who had the time to explain, or with the fury of someone who had been wounded. Instead, I sent a photograph. A moment caught on my phone of Jonah smiling crookedly beside a stack of novels he had recommended to a customer. It was a small thing. To me, it was everything. Her response surprised me. It was 2 sentences. Not an apology but an olive branch that felt shaped from the very pride that had once been armor. "He looks like you," she wrote. I didn't expect that. That, more than words, was a kind of surrender. Not full reconciliation, but a soft opening. It did not erase the hurt of what she'd said that rainy afternoon, the thing that had started this whole unraveling. But it meant that the woman who had said, "You're not really family," was beginning, in her own small way, to see the messy evidence of a different kind of family. We never had a tidy reconciliation. Louise and I sat across from each other one afternoon on her porch, the rosemary a spindly sentinel between us. The conversation was halting. There were apologies, more like begrudging rearrangements of truth than ceremonial absolutions. "I was afraid," she said finally, in a voice that felt smaller than it used to. "I was afraid that if you loved someone else, you would stop loving me." "I could never stop loving you," I said. "But loving someone doesn't mean we stop making room for others. It means we expand." She nodded like a woman learning to make an extravagant meal from fewer ingredients. "I don't know how to be enough for you," she confessed. "I raised you the only way I knew." "I know," I said. "And I love you for the life you gave me. But I also chose a life. And Jonah needed me." There were concessions on both sides. Louise began to invite Jonah to holiday dinners, tentatively at first, and then more often as the years passed. She watched him from the corner of the living room during family gatherings, an expression on her face that mingled curiosity and something like pride. When Jonah sat at her dining table and made a joke about burnt turkey like it was a national right, she laughed out loud in a way that sounded relieved. Not everything was smoothed over. There were times when she withdrew fully and didn't return for months, showing up instead in letters that were formal and polite. There were other times when she showed up with a casserole and a small hand-whittled toy for Jonah. The relationship was more honest when it wasn't pretending to be unbroken. We learned, painfully, that family can be resilient without being perfect. The legal process moved slowly toward permanency. Birth certificates were examined under legal folds. DNA tests were performed with the sterile, procedural dignity of science humming in the background. The results connected us, not in some cinematic way, but in legal and biological proof that Jonah and I shared a lineage that had once been hidden by poverty and shame. There was a moment, cold and thin, when the paper clattered down on the clerk's desk and the woman who worked there looked at us and said, "Congratulations." I felt something in my chest unclench that I hadn't recognized as tension until it was gone. Even with DNA, the transformation of stranger to brother took time. We had to learn how to be relatives in a world that had almost classified our connection as an administrative error. We had to learn how to argue about bills and how to forgive old slights that had not been intended for the other party but had landed there anyway. There were nights when Jonah would call me years later, from somewhere on a road trip, and say, "I'm thinking of you," the wording of which was casual and exactly the kind of love that stays. There were long stretches where I missed the woman who had raised me, Louise at her most unapologetically affectionate, and long stretches where I resented her cowardice. There were moments when I wished for a simple narrative, an either/, or that would make sense of love and belonging. But life kept teaching me in increments, that family could be both the loose and the stitched together, that people can be both kind and small, both brave and afraid. If something in this story touches you, if it reminds you of a word that was said over coffee, at a dinner table, across a kitchen, please share it in the comments. Has something like this ever happened to you? I'm reading everything. When Jonah graduated from high school, he did it wearing the cap that was a little too big, with a grin that had the kind of honest mischief I recognized in mirrors. Louise came to the ceremony. She sat at the back, small and steady, and clapped like someone who had been given a second chance to learn how to be visible. Afterward, she hugged Jonah in a way that felt awkward and beautiful at the same time. I watched them and felt something like awe and then like gratitude. The woman who had once said, "You're not really family," had learned, slowly and reluctantly, what I had always thought, that family is made by the choice to show up again and again. What I learned through all of it, the hearings, the nights without sleep, the dented patience, the small, miraculous mornings, is that family is not a simple chain of blood. It is a web of decisions, of tiny daily acts of presence and care that add up over time. The truth that Louise had wielded like a weapon was true in one sense. Blood can bind people together in ways that are powerful and important. But the opposite truth, equally fierce, is that love can be chosen and that choosing is powerful in a different way. There is dignity in being chosen, but there is humility in choosing. Years later, when people ask me how I navigated that winter, how I went from hearing a sentence that could have paralyzed me to building a household with a teenager who was not my by-blood sibling, I tell them it was nothing heroic. It was a series of unglamorous choices: answering a phone call, driving through rain, signing a folder, holding a hand through nightmares, eating burnt toast and forgiving 1,000 small humiliations. It's messy work. It's slow. It doesn't make for easy headlines. But it changes everything. Not because it is grand, but because it is true. Because one decision, to show up rather than step away, can reroute a life. In the end, Louise and I never returned to the geometry we had once known. We found a new axis instead, one comprised of boundaries and affection both carefully negotiated. Jonah grew into something that defied the shelters and the forms that once tried to define him. He became someone who could laugh and be surprised and love instead of merely surviving. If you took anything from this, remember, family will tell you the stories you did not choose. You get to decide which of them you let define you. And if you find yourself at the edge of making a decision that scares you, know that it might be the hinge on which everything else turns.